India's current commitments requires us to reduce the carbon intensity of our GDP to 33 to 35% by 2030 and expand renewable energy capacity to 175 gigawatt by 2022. Policy action to attain this goal is likely to be unduly expensive and influenced by short-term political motives rather than long-term planning if it isn't supported by a robust and targeted regulatory framework. This panel on low carbon growth discussing India's climate commitments and tracing our progress till date will discuss India's net zero commitments and track our progress to meeting our commitments by 2022. Now, I would first like to welcome our moderator, Swati D'Souza, India Lead Analyst and Coordinator at International Energy Agency. Welcome, Ms. D'Souza. And the panelists for this discussion are Naina Lal Kidwai, Chair, India Sanitation Coalition; Seema Arora, Deputy Director General, Confederation of India Industry; Mikhail Greenstone, Director, Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. Welcome, everyone. Pleasure to have you all here. Over to you.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us. We have a very esteemed panel with us today. We have Seema Arora, Deputy Director General from Confederation of Indian Industries; Naina Lal Kidwai, Chair, India Sanitation Coalition; and Michael Greenstone, Director, Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago. Thank you everybody for joining this panel for this event. So without further ado, actually, let me just start off with the questions because we have a lot to discuss and very little time. So Seema, my first question is to you, actually. We're now 8 years from 2030. Last year, the Prime Minister at Glasgow had announced that India will achieve net zero emissions by 2070. How do you track our progress so far from the first NDC? And what are your expectations for the years ahead in terms of how we will meet both the Paris commitments as well as the Glasgow Pact?
Thank you. It's great to be a part of this very illustrious panel. And as you asked, Swati, I think I believe that India is really on track to meet its commitments, especially the commitments that have been put by India under the NDCs. And of course, subsequently also the commitments of 2070 that the Honorable Prime Minister outlined at Glasgow. And some of the things that give us this confidence is that we've had specific focus in this year's budget on areas such as renewable energy to catalyze the domestic manufacturing of high efficiency modules. A huge allocation has been made using the PLI scheme. And this would ensure that we achieve the ambitious target of 280 gigawatts installed solar capacity by 2030. In addition to this, the MNRE has also allocated a huge amount of money for solar energy sector, including both grid interactive and off-grid projects. This is on the renewable side. Simultaneously, as we know, that the government has launched the National Hydrogen Mission, and this would aim to make India a green hydrogen hub, which would drastically reduce our carbon footprint. Even though we continue to grow, if we are able to green our fuel supply by getting more green hydrogen into the system, which is the plan, again, we will be able to reduce our carbon footprint. We also see a huge push in the transport sector decarbonizing, and which is also very heartening. There is, the EV push that is there. Niti Aayog has recently released a draft policy on battery swapping, which will improve the efficiency in the EV ecosystem. The national biofuel policy has been amended. So again, this will reduce the dependence on fossil fuels. And there's a new target to achieve 20% ethanol blending in fuel by 2026 instead of which was earlier 2030. So we've brought in the target a few years earlier. From the corporate side also, we see a huge amount of commitment. And at CII, we see a lot of our members, obviously large members, committing to actions such as net zero GHG emissions, signing up to science-based targets. And some of them have also got their targets validated internationally. So we do see a lot of momentum. And I think we are on track to meet the commitments that India has made.
So I go straight to Naina. Naina, you've been in the industry, it's still a very big figure within the Indian industry. My question to you is, do you see the industry playing a large role in the decarbonization process? Do you see, in your experience, has it changed post Glasgow, or do you see a changing trend within the industry? Can you give us your take on that?
Thank you, Swati, and delighted to be on discussion on this very important subject. I think SEMA has captured well the various facets of what India itself is committed to. And in committing to these, once government actually sets these targets, industry feels compelled to follow. So certainly from an India perspective, I think there is a buy-in. I do believe even before Glasgow, we did have a huge commitment from industry in the renewables area, not just companies that are in the manufacture of renewables or providing of renewable energy, but also from companies that found it a very easy win. And why is it an easy win? In a country like ours, where fuel costs are expensive and have only gone up across the world, in fact, thanks to the Ukraine issue, a buy-in to get efficient, cheaper energy and win accolades for being green are indeed very much in industry's sights. And we have seen, therefore, a large commitment from industry across the board, both big users and smaller users, the companies I'm on the boards of, pharma companies, others. The easy win is the buy-in on the renewables front. I think, though, we do need to go beyond just that. We must do what we're doing in terms of a buy-in on renewables and energy. But what we need from companies is innovation in terms of lower carbon footprints, more energy efficiency. So how do we measure how efficient we are in the use of energy? More recycling of scarce materials like water. So by widening the definition of how we look at a sustainable future, which is not just a renewable story for the country, is, I think, where the focus needs to be. And it can be a battle well won if we go into measurement. And I think many companies are now, as Seema has rightly pointed out, signing up to net zero. But I fear many of those targets look very soft. They've been announced 2030. CEO doesn't know if he's going to be there or not. So it's easy to sort of chuck this ball out 7 to 10 years. The really serious companies and boards, I can certainly tell you the ones I sit on, we have gone to science-based targeting, where every year is being measured and declared, and this at a global level. So the global companies are now beginning to understand that their skepticism around net zero targets are very much now in the zone of science-based targeting. And we are seeing sustainability indices, whether it's the Dow Jones Index or CDP or whatever, are also requiring and measuring companies in each sector against these performances. And the good news is the market is rewarding those companies that have signed up to these, in that these are tending to be companies who quote better in terms of market cap on exchanges. So I think the investor community, I know the investor community is looking out to ensure that in the sector, they invest in those companies that have bought into these. So I think we are seeing investors, shareholders, stakeholders requiring this. Companies, those that are more enlightened, are going into this in a very effective way. And the process and measurement of ensuring that targets are being achieved on an annual basis in terms of the net zero signups are indeed also happening, which widens it beyond the renewables only to these other facets of being responsible, sustainable, and indeed contributing to this journey.
So, Michael, my question to you is, you've often referred to the social cost of carbon as the most important figure we've never heard of. I also know that you and your team are working towards developing the world's first empirically derived estimate of the social cost of carbon. Tell us more about it. Can it help countries like India better map out their low carbon growth?
Thank you for the terrific question. So the key thing about climate change is it's going to happen in the future. And so you have to make projections on what the damages will be. And up until recently, we had to rely on projections that were largely based on assumptions and educated guesses. And what I have been co-leading with several colleagues is a group that is trying to build an empirically founded estimate of what climate damages will be. And it's empirically founded in the sense that it uses data from the entire world, including India, to develop these estimates. And the key number that comes out of that is what is referred to as the social cost of carbon. And that's the damages associated with the release of an additional ton of CO2. And the reason that that's so important, let's just suppose that it's about, my research would suggest it's about $200 per ton. And so what that means per ton of CO2 is that for every ton that we mitigate or fail to, or prevent ourselves from emitting, we're doing our future selves and our children and our grandchildren about $200 worth of benefits. And that come in the form of avoided climate change. And the reason that's can be so useful is it gives a bright line on the kinds of policies that government can undertake that would be beneficial. So anything that costs, let's say $100 per ton for abating CO2, we now know that that's a desirable policy. And the reason it's a desirable policy is because it's going to produce $200 of benefits and only cost $100. And that the social cost of carbon is the number that helps define that bright line between policies that are desirable and policies that are undesirable. It is also worth highlighting, in contrast, there are some policies, very expensive policies, that might cost $500 per ton of CO2 abated. Those policies would not, if the social cost of carbon is $200, as my research suggests, those kinds of policies would be much less desirable because they cost more than the benefits they're producing.
Seema, do you see supply chains evolving? So we have the large players, as Nena mentioned, who are being rewarded by the market, by the investors. But what about the supply chains that behind them? Do you see that evolving as well when we're looking at decarbonization?
Yes, supply chains, because predominantly supply chains are made of MSME industry. There lies a challenge there, right? However, we are seeing that companies who are signing up, as Nana said, to SBTI, the Science Based Target Initiative, or any other initiative, if they have to go net zero or have to meet their yearly commitment under the Science Based Target Initiative, there's no way that they can do it without, also making the transition in their supply chain. So now we are seeing that companies, even though earlier when they would have signed, they would not have visualized the fact that they would have to make sure that their supply chain partners also transition to a low carbon pathway. They now are beginning to understand, because when you're going to a science-based target trajectory, you have to go to your scope 3 emissions. And scope 3 emissions by definition cover all your supply chain partners. It's a slow transition, but we see now companies coming back to us and saying that, give us the tools and the frameworks to work with our supply chain partners. And as CII, we have created, MSME toolkits, sustainable value chain certification programs, so that companies can actually work with their supply chain partners. But let me say that it's not easy. It is quite challenging, simply because, we've just had COVID. The MSME sector is already under distress. Making any change there means a huge amount of effort. But if the partnership approach that we are seeing with the large OEMs or the large companies working with their supply chain continues, then it would be very much possible. As CII, we've created a platform where large companies can bring their suppliers together, share their learnings, so that they can collaboratively make their supply chain partners make the transition. And we see that it's working in some manner, because large companies are coming together. But it is going to take time, simply because it's a huge challenge. But no transition can be complete until we have the supply chain partners and the MSME partners taking equal action as we go forward. Yeah.
Thanks, Seema. So it's true, actually, because every time the Prime Minister or the Minister of Environment actually speaks at any of the international forums, they keep highlighting the challenge, not just from a large company perspective, but also the MSME sector. And one of the things that that India keeps talking about is that while we transition away from fossil fuels, we also have to meet our sustainable development goals going forward. So, Nena, my question to you is, as the chair of the India Sanitation Coalition, how do you see this unique challenge playing out? Because India is actually in a very unique position where we're still growing, but at the same and pulling a lot of people out of poverty, but at the same time also transitioning. So, in relation to water, in relation to some of these challenges, development challenges that we have, which is not particularly related to climate, but plays a huge part in how we transition. How do you see this playing out?
So I think it's great that you can ask this question, Swati, because one of the biggest success stories of the Modi government, I believe, has been the Swachh Bharat mission, a target which looked really tough to achieve when it was set out way back in 2014. And the journey India has traveled in terms of access to toilets and indeed even usage of those toilets, while maybe still not where we would like it, which is 100%, is in fact up in the 90s. And this is something which we really did not expect, but India went at it hammer and tongs. And it is seen on two fronts, both in the provision of infrastructure and also one of the biggest behavioral change exercises anywhere in the world, which has met with the nature of success we have. So what we have got through the sanitation game is a very important achievement, which we can't let up on because bad habits will again creep in, and we need to make sure that utilization of toilets, repair of toilets, and functioning toilets remains. Now, having said that, this could be one of the most expensive experiments in history that goes bad if we cannot treat the shit. Because at the one end, we have captured it through the system by making people use the pots, communal, private, or whatever. But at the end of the day, if that just goes right back into the fields which we took it out of, we are not going to have achieved what needs to be achieved. So the big focus for us in the India Sanitation Coalition, which FICCI supports, is on treatment. And there's a big program both by the FICCI Water Mission and by the India Sanitation Coalition on the treatment. And this treatment becomes a very important part of keeping the environment clean. If we don't, we have all sorts of issues that emerge. Now, the big linkage, and for India, yes, carbon footprint is important. It's important because of what it does in terms of, as we well know, global warming. But on the other side, it's also about what we do in terms of burning. We burn plastic. So that finds its way into the environment and is very, very poor in terms of the carbon footprint it leaves behind. Equally, through a measurement of the SDGs, something like sanitation and water, those SDGs are very strongly linked to health and nutrition. So by the same token that pollution, which is clearly linked into the whole climate exercise, produces poor health, as we well know, in terms of lungs and infections, etc. On the other hand, poor water and sanitation has shown that it translates to very poor nutrition in children in particular. And the statistics actually of a family health survey, which was done, in fact, by and UNICEF has highlighted this, is that 48% of India's children under the age of 5 were stunted. This is as per a study in 2014. Stunted as in not growing to their full physical size. 43% were underweight and 20% were wasted. So that is what we do. We create an issue for the young kids today, and it comes largely because of the infection, which comes both from open defecation on the one side, which in turn causes diarrhea, which therefore causes nutrition issues in terms of the way children are not able to even retain whatever food they are being given. And I think, therefore, it becomes very important in terms of the WASH agenda that we have. Ultimately, the carbon footprint, climate, have all to be linked finally to the SDGs that we sign up to. And doing this in a holistic way is so important, which our government has fortunately fully recognized. And hence we see the success, I believe, of the sanitation and water movement in the country. We are currently working with the ministry on a very important exercise where corporates are coming forward to adopt districts to ensure that sanitation and water provision in the districts they adopt, and these will largely be around factories where they are present or where they are doing CSR work, that the corporates become part of the program with the not-for-profits, government and the panchayats to ensure that these programs are well delivered. So I think the role of corporates going forward is very, very critical. A, in terms of exactly as Seema also mentioned, what the corporate themselves sign up to, but B, also what they do outside the fence in terms of community engagement and making sure that all stakeholders are benefited by what is being done.
So, Michael, we know that the command and control style of regulation characterizes the environmental policies of countries like India, and that there is a need to look at innovative approaches. Nena did speak of innovation, the need for innovation as well. So tell us more about your thoughts on how pollution markets can help India achieve its climate commitments.
So the traditional way that pollution has been regulated in the United States, in India, around the world, has been to put out very specific rules that say polluters should install this particular form of pollution abatement equipment, or make this change to their factory, or use this kind of fuel or that kind of fuel. And it has a kind of intuitive and reflexive appeal. The problem, because you have the sense, well, if I install this piece of abatement equipment or switch these fuels, I know what I'm going to get. The problem is that those kinds of approaches are not well tuned to what I think of as the global energy challenge, or the trade-offs that India and really every other country around the world faces. And the trade-offs that they face is between the urgent need for rapid economic growth, which is true in India, true throughout the world, and environmental quality. And these kinds of command and control approaches can be effective. Sometimes they aren't, but can be effective at reducing pollution, but often at great cost. And as an alternative, using markets or cap and trade or pollution taxes as a way of reducing pollution is a much better way to balance between those two goals. And what it does is it unleashes the creativity and the innovation of firms in the economy to find the cheapest way to reduce pollution. So rather than the government stipulating the way to do it, it unleashes this creativity. Now, what's especially interesting about this in the Indian context is that the government of Gujarat ran a randomized control trial, just like you would run a randomized control trial to figure out what drugs would help cure a particular illness, to test whether or not cap and trade policies, which are a form of market-based regulation, can work in India. And the results are extraordinarily striking. Particulates pollution went down by 24% among the firms that were regulated in this new innovative way, relative to the firms that were regulated in the traditional way. And not only that, that appeared to occur with very little additional cost for industry. So it is an opportunity to have the rare win-win in environmental policy, where you can facilitate faster economic growth while also protecting the environment and allowing people to breathe clean air. And I should just add that the government of Gujarat was so taken with these results that in May, they announced that they would launch a cap and trade program for carbon dioxide as part of the state's commitment to fulfilling Prime Minister Modi's international commitments. And so I just think there is a tremendous opportunity for switching from command and control regulation in India to more market-based approaches. And the power of those market-based approaches is it'll facilitate faster economic growth and achievement of environmental goals. It's kind of like, my children, some of them like vanilla, some of them like chocolate ice cream. You can have both with markets.
what do you expect from the Indian taxonomy? There is a document that is potentially coming out sometime this year that sort of defines what is green, what is not green. Do you have any expectations coming out from the taxonomy? So I'll Seema, if you can go first, and then if you can follow after Seema.
Yeah, Swati, I think broadly, I would think four kinds of expectations or four areas that we could hopefully, leverage this taxonomy framework. One, of course, the primary expectation is how can it enable us to increase the various sources of climate funding coming into the country? Because we need climate funding from international sources, from public sources, from private sources, and we need to enable easier access of finance so that we can do the transition much faster. So the taxonomy framework should definitely enable us that. Secondly, it should also help develop the capacity of the India's BFSI sector to integrate climate related risks into their investments. Third, while we expect that it will be in line with the global frameworks, it should consider localized market conditions in the country because India is different. We are 29 countries within one country and it's very different. So we need to make sure that it allows the flexibility while in alignment with global frameworks is flexible enough to respond to the dynamic differences that India as a country has. Finally, it should provide a clear direction to stakeholders such as RBI, SEBI, etc. And that would allow that the action happens on the earlier 3 points that I mentioned, that it is aligned with global frameworks, but is nimble enough to take into account our localized conditions. So I would have these four expectations. Thank you.
Thank you, Seema. Sundana?
I think having a taxonomy which everyone understands is critical. And it plays back to my first point, which is we don't just look to renewables. We look at the various aspects, energy efficiency, others which are buried in the way companies operate, but which are possibly not being measured sufficiently or understood. So finance will follow renewables, but finance may not necessarily follow energy efficiency because those numbers are not clearly defined out there for an understanding of why a particular company is doing better than another on that front. So it's not being rewarded sufficiently. And I think a taxonomy which broadens, therefore, these definitions, helps us measure them and enables like a certificate to be provided, which is ultimately audited as well. It's not just that the company understands it and that the investor or the bank understands it, but there should also be a reaffirmation that it is indeed as is stated. I think ensures that companies continue to improve year by year in terms of their delivery. I think the point of finance is a very valid one because what we have had happen, whether equity or debt, it followed into the renewable space because that was so obvious. How do we make sure that this money follows into these other spaces? Can only happen as we broaden the definition, measure that redefinition, and reward the companies that are indeed complying on multiple fronts and not just on the obvious ones, which is the provision of renewable energy. On the point of local conditions, I feel very strongly that whatever we do in India better be aligned to the global context. Because if it's too difficult for investors to understand, and particularly global investors, and there's big money that follows these changes, and I think they are frankly far more enlightened than our Indian funds. We are not really seeing this discipline coming through our Indian mutual funds or even the Indian banks now, sadly. That must change. But in order for this first flush of money to come in a much wider context in India, I think we will have to make it easy for foreign money to understand what those parameters are when applied in India. I do think we need to have local targets, etc., as well. But in doing that, for the local conditionalities that we increase or bring in, we need to make sure that our local funds, our local banks sign up to those and grow that so that ultimately the two merge, the global and local. So we need to start the two journeys almost simultaneously, but not try and reinvent the wheel for ourselves here. And I fear there's a little bit of that happening. The second confusion, and having the one taxonomy is so important, is we had, for example, SEBI coming in with its strictures, and on the other hand, the Ministry of Corporate Affairs developing theirs. And while each refers to the other, excuse me, each refers to the other, what we mustn't get is multiple measurement formats that emerge, which causes, again, confusion both from the companies. By the way, we are not unique in this. What you see elsewhere in the world is utter confusion on some of this. There are very many different measures, and therefore you're now seeing the European Union, etc., looking at more unified measurements as well. And I think the EU's measurement ones will be one of the first, which is a merged measurement system, which we can then borrow from and live off, even while we look at the local conditionalities. I think there's one aspect of money that I think I should bring up, being an erstwhile banker, and that is also what banks should not fund. So at one, reward good practice, but there must also be things that we see. For example, a company that has not set itself sustainable targets, a company that has not even demonstrated it's on the journey. We as lenders can insist that unless they demonstrate that there's a buy-in, whether it's with their supply chain or with their own journey, that the funding to them is something they cannot take for granted. So who we will not fund is as important as what we do in terms of equity funds that we may attract into our businesses. So a long way to go. It's an very early journey, but I do think many aspects of it that are important. I would just add on supply chains, because you had raised this earlier, a very important journey, but one which needs to be dealt with now. At one level, our larger MSMEs get it. And the larger MSMEs tend to be part of the large OEM chains. And I think with some support and help, they are quite keen to get on the bandwagon. The problem is the multiple smaller SMEs that fall into the same package. And there, I believe government has to play a role. And that role has to be that there are clusters of business typically, there are industry parks. If you speak to any of these guys, they find it very difficult to navigate this journey. So if we, for example, provide the renewable energy source, you provide the sanitation and treatment, sewage treatment source, they have to pay a charge which supports that capital expenditure. But the expenditure is a shared expenditure. The same way as government has made it mandatory for buildings over a certain size to have sewage treatment plants, we should ensure that for every industry park, every cluster of small businesses, that this provision is provided by government or enabled by government, that each little company can't do it on its own, because it will never happen that way.
So, Michael, when we are looking at climate mitigation strategies, what do you think is the role of a highly resolved climate, a role that a highly resolved climate projection framework is capable of predicting, and how can it play for countries like India?
I think a great challenge with climate policy has been the climate scientists often talk about, well, global mean temperatures are going to change by 2 degrees C or 3 degrees C, and there'll be some overall impact on global GDP. The problem is nobody lives at the mean. People live in particular places. They live in Mumbai, they live in Patna, they live in Delhi, and what they're really interested in is what's going to happen where they live. And so a lot of my research has been focused on developing highly localized estimates of what climate change is going to mean. And so in the case of India, at the district level, we have estimates of what will happen to the number of very hot days, what will happen to crop yields, what will happen to stressors for human health and even mortality rates. And my view is that kind of information that's delivered at the level where people actually live can be very useful in generating activism for advocating for climate policy, but also for local areas to develop strategies for adjusting and adapting to climate change. So if you know that this particular set of day heat wave will cause health stressors, then you can set up cooling centers or air conditioning or do more to water crops. So that's why I think getting these highly resolved local estimates of what climate change means is so important.
Nana, I actually want to come back to you for the next question itself. So you mentioned 2 or 3 key challenges. One is the finance side of it. One is the smaller SMEs. So are there any more implementation related challenges that you see that we will have to face when we are moving towards a low carbon pathway or a decarbonization pathway? Do you see any more? And this is not just from an industry perspective, but often, as part of a think tank, what we always like to say is you need better coordination between industry, between governments, and between consumers at the end of the day. So keeping in mind some of the key stakeholders, do you see actually a lot of implementation challenges going forward?
I think because the journey is new, of course, there are challenges, and it's happening at a time when companies have been hurt through COVID. Many are just about recovering. Huge commodity price increases, energy and fuel cost increases. So you've got margins which are getting compressed. You have nervousness around, is there a recession around the corner? I firmly am of the view that we aren't going to see a recession, certainly not in India. But the fact is that fear does indeed persist. And it's for companies to then think about survival and also look to the future in a way that I believe is about their future survival. But when they still only recognize survival today, it becomes that much harder to try and cajole and coax them into looking at the longer term survival when survival today itself is an issue. So I think that becomes the biggest challenge. And so we have to make that journey easier. Can we do it by assisting with a credit, which is cheaper? How can we bring some of the funds that are available abroad, which can come by way of carbon credit type of mechanisms, which helps companies in this journey? The taxonomy of even recognizing what they're doing and rewarding it all helps. So that helping hand is going to be very important because the challenges are several. I think the other area is our consumers. You find the consumer abroad far more with it in terms of looking at labels, understanding whether that company is indeed compliant, seeking fabrics which actually show that they are indeed safe for the environment. That whole education, and ideally the provision of these products should not be for a higher price, although people should be prepared to pay a higher price, but it's not going to happen easily. But at least all things being equal, I opt for the product which is safer for the environment, I think would be the whole consumer education space, which we have not yet seen in our country.
Yeah, consumer awareness. And this is an issue not just from, so even when we look at energy transitions or coal transitions, often the point is raised by the stakeholders themselves that we're not aware of a lot of things that are happening, of a lot of changes that need to be made. Seema, as an industry association, my question is, what if when you speak to the government, what are some of the measures that you think need to be adopted so that Indian industry can have access to greater capital? What are some of these conversations that you've been having with the government?
So like you asked the question, one of the main thing, that is required, and we, of course, are always speaking, is the finance for the transition to happen. And therefore, the taxonomy part is very important. So sooner we have clarity on what qualifies as green, and sooner that understanding comes in, we are able to leverage that finance. I think also additionally, making finance accessible and reducing the risk for investment into these projects is very important. A lot of the times global investments do not flow outside of OECD countries and China because of lack of investor confidence in the return of investment. So that confidence in the ecosystem is very important. Maybe some, special blended finance facilities can be set up that can take up the issue of risk mitigation, payment guarantees, etc. This is the conversation we have with the government. This will give investors the confidence to invest in India. Also, financing roadmaps for the transitions, which are well laid out. See, renewable, as Naina said, has been a huge success because the roadmap is well laid out, right? We need to lay out the roadmap for other things also. And the policy direction has to be clear. Then we will be able to capture this overseas finance, private and public both, and including domestic finance, if it is a well laid out transition roadmap. And also this should go hand in hand with the issues of upstream de-risking, etc., and providing a pipeline of bankable projects, which also needs to be done. And that needs to be done by different stakeholders. These are some of the conversations. And finally, I think sectors of industry have to work in synergy, in lock and step. Because if we are looking at a transition, let's say of a sector like the housing sector, then the steel industry, the cement industry, all of these industries have to work together and they have to work in sync. We've seen that in the EV, there has been sometimes not a sync. Should we have a charging infrastructure not available, the vehicles available, but the charging so a lot of syncing of different sectors and different players and stakeholders so that the whole ecosystem can make the transition. So that's not just the responsibility of the government, it's as much a responsibility of the industry. But these are some of the key ingredients of the transition to really happen. Thank you.
And I want to pick up on this point Seema's made. And if you look at the whole building sector, for example, we need to move from looking at each vertical as we do to a much more holistic one. And, she clearly defined the building sector itself, steel, cement, and how we build. I would add sewage, water management, everything into that. But beyond that, we also have to look at how we plan urban infrastructure. So our cities are, as we well know, a disaster. And we live in these, hotbeds of pollution and mess and, frankly, construction dust and all kinds of things which shouldn't, in fact, happen. If the planning as we go ahead, if in terms of at least some of the suburban areas, and we look at each of our regions as we build them, in ways where, on the one hand, the old Western system where people lived in suburbs and all commuted down to one downtown has to go, because we burn energy doing that. We crowd our roads. It doesn't work. Poor public transportation systems, which forces people to take cars. The way we manage water in cities which we are on the banks of the Yamuna in Delhi. Why are we water short? In areas of Delhi, water is available at 3 feet below the ground. And in others, it's at 80. Why are we not able to distribute water effectively? And then we turn around and tell people that they can't have their own means of pulling out water, which of course is about managing our aquifers, tube wells, etc. But what are they to do if they don't have water? So the solutions we provide in an urban environment have to be very much a part of an urban plan, which is holistic. And then people work within that, A, to comply, and B, to then improve. But our urban planning is certainly something which we could put a lot more focus in. And by doing that, we know that in terms of, say, pollution, it comes, yes, 25% maybe from stubble burning. And by the way, there are wonderful solutions to that right now. I'm on the board of a company, UPL, which actually has an organic, like a fungicide, which will help the soil through removing the stubble and ensure that we don't have to burn. So you've got two benefits there. But, how do we implement these in terms of the climate impact, the solutions which are out there and proven, but not still at scale, and make sure that these things happen on the one, which is the whole agricultural management side of it. And the second is the whole urban planning area as well.
Michael, from your extensive work with state governments in India, you understand the policy and implementation landscape quite well. What do you think are a few critical steps that India will have to adopt if it has to, achieve the net zero emissions goal by 2070?
My view on this is it's kind of one foot in front of the other. And I think there are, the 2070 goals can seem daunting. They also seem very far away. And I think there's no substitute for just getting started. And there are a couple things that I think India could do that are in the spirit of getting started that would really prove to be quite consequential. The first is, I think, setting up a national market for sulfur dioxide, cap and trade market for sulfur dioxide would pay enormous dividends for the people of India. It would lead to great improvements in air quality. That air quality would allow people to lead longer and healthier lives. As the Air Quality Life Index that the University of Chicago and my institute puts out shows, people are leading shorter and sicker lives because of air pollution in India. And this would be an important tool in confronting that challenge. A second thing I think that would be important would be to help to set up some pilots as the state of Gujarat is a leader on, for running cap and trade programs for carbon dioxide as a way of starting to directly target the source of climate change. So those are kind of two pretty granular ones, but I think they offer really great rewards. Maybe some more I'll raise two more systematic things that I think are very important. The first is, in the United States, the Clean Air Act has been one of the most successful pieces of legislation. And the reason is it has at its center the goal to protect the public health. That key phrase, to protect the public health, is missing from India's version of the Clean Air Act. I think having an amendment that inserted that would be tremendously beneficial. And the reason is it would move a lot of environmental policy away from kind of a technical exercise to one that's really in service to people's health and well-being. And I think that would allow for the discovery and experimentation and implementation of policies that are going to do much more to improve people's well-being and make tangible what the benefits of environmental policies are. The second thing that I would recommend is more systemic, and I know there's been in the recent parliament, the monsoon parliament, there's been some proposals in this direction, would be the implementation of language that would allow for the direct regulation of carbon dioxide. Right now, the easiest way to regulate carbon dioxide is through kind of as a co-benefit of other policies. And I think making that an explicit goal is a critical first step to making progress on India's commitment for net zero emissions by 2070. Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us at this panel. Seema, Naina, Michael, it was a pleasure chatting with all of you, and thank you.
Thank you for delving deeper into the discussion and sharing opportunities and challenges that dot our journey of meeting climate commitments. So now, following the format that we have our conference today, we will talk about exciting projects that aim to fast-track India's low-carbon growth story.